Hello, cooking enthusiasts. This is slightly more present day cue to say that this footage and half of this narration was archived from quite a while ago. I have it saved for when I was busy working on some other projects, but it fits perfectly with my summer theme of frozen desserts. It's not the only type of video I'll be making, but I will be making a lot, so please check out the previous recipes for semi, and also please check out my cookbook, Gelato Obsession. It's available in the link in the description as a $5 download. I had an interesting little journey replicating a recipe from somebody I follow and who I know a little bit, Dave Arnold's caramelized onion ice cream. For those that don't know, Dave Arnold is a chef, bartender, cookbook author, and developer of gadgets like the Searsol and the Spinzol centrifuge, and host of the podcast Cooking Issues. So this is a recipe he's discussed on his show multiple times, and he finally released a written recipe for it. On the surface, it's pretty simple. You basically use the higher temperatures afforded by pressure cooking to caramelize onions in a completely hands-off sort of way, with the addition of some extra sugar. For my purposes, though, I definitely needed to do some annoying calculations because I like to know the sugar and also fat composition of any ingredients going into one of my frozen desserts. I did also need to adjust the cooking time because I was using a less powerful countertop pressure cooker, whereas his recipe is designed for a stovetop pressure cooker that can reach higher pressures. For the actual ice cream, that caramelized onion mixture gets blended with a pretty classic contemporary creme anglaise base. Of course, the sugar was measured in grams, but the milk and cream were done by volume, and the egg yolks just by the number of yolks. So again, a little bit of recalculating just so the recipe would fit into the system I use. And the stats were obviously much higher in fat and slightly lower in sweetness compared to anything I have made from a gelato perspective. But again, the recipe itself was pretty straightforward. I did need to adjust the procedure to cook sous vide in a jar instead of a bag because I do not have a vacuum sealer that handles liquids. Now comes the part of my little journey where I definitely made the biggest departure from Dave's original recipe. He calls for draining the liquid from this caramelized onion mixture, blending the solids, and then adding back the liquid until it looks right. So I had no idea what it was supposed to look like, and I also assumed that a good amount of the added brown sugar was actually dissolved in that liquid. So just blending everything together and weighing the total was the only way to somewhat accurately calculate the sugar content of the ingredient, which I needed for Dave's recipe and developing my own. I did also forget to add some milk powder at this stage, but I think the difference would have been negligible. And finally, we blended equal parts of Dave's custard base recipe with the caramelized onions. Funnily enough, once they are blended together, this new mixture has a fat content in line with what I would make for a gelato, although the sweetness are a little bit low and there is way less anti-freezing power, especially compared to my personal recipes. So, as is good with pretty much any ice cream base, we let that sit overnight and then churned it the next day. Right off the bat, I will say I think there are some improvements I need to make for the actual onion procedure. That's a limitation based on the equipment I have, but at the very least, I'm using the same caramelized onions for his recipe and my recipe. So in that way, it will be pretty fair. Now we are back to this older, grizzled version of me for the rest of the narration. Once again, the footage and the first half of narration was from several months ago. My gelato version of this flavor started with the same quantity of the same caramelized onions, 500 grams. Next, we are measuring and adding some molasses. This is probably the biggest flavor deviation compared to Dave's recipe, but we are able to build up and adjust things centered around the caramelized onions instead of just blending it with an existing ice cream base. So this is part of rebalancing to increase the sweetness and also highlights the brown sugar and the notes naturally in caramelized onions. One sort of practical thing I want to point out is that when you're working with molasses or honey or any viscous like that, it's helpful to measure it early in the process. And then you can see we're also measuring the heavy cream and even the milk in sequence using the same container. By measuring in this order and zeroing the scale every time, we essentially rinse the container with the less viscous ingredients and ensure we get everything that we measured. Because we were doing multiple recipes in that sequence, we are actually going to be cooking this gelato base using the blender, and this is not something that every blender is able to do. All of my other gelato recipes simply call for cooking with a double boiler and then finishing with a stick blender. So a machine like this is absolutely not necessary. It just is convenient. So we are adding the dry ingredients slowly. Again, these dry ingredients are very different from the sugars used in Dave's recipe, namely that we're able to add dextrose, which will create a much softer, scoopable texture. If you ever do attempt making a gelato like this with a Vitamix or similar device designed for blending and cooking, just take things very slow, have the power just high enough to create a vortex without it exploding everywhere. Once all the ingredients are in, we're blending on high to generate friction until we hit our target temperature. And it's important that the pour spout is open but covered with a towel to prevent steam buildup. Jumping ahead to reaching the temperature, we do standard cooling down with cold water and ice before operating overnight. We jump ahead to the next day, and the gelato base has already been blended off camera. We're now adding my last little secret ingredient, which is acid phosphate, and that brings a nice balance to all of the sweetness before it begins to be pre-chilled like all of my other recipes. Now we are just churning the gelato, and I can start to talk about some comparisons. To reiterate what I said earlier in the video, I think a major shortcoming was the way I prepared the actual caramelized onions. So that's not an issue with the recipe, but just the equipment I have access to. Because of that, the extra sweetness and other flavors in my version did help cover some of that up. That being said, I still think I would have preferred my gelato version even if the onions were better, but that is obviously up to personal preference. The last comparison we can talk about is the texture. So obviously Dave's version of the recipe was much harder right out of the freezer, but that can be solved by tempering. There were also some noticeable ice crystals, but again, I can chalk that up to my equipment because I'm sure Dave designed and tested this recipe with much better restaurant quality ice cream machines. My gelato version of the recipe was super smooth, rich, creamy, scoopable directly out of the freezer. And this isn't to dog on Dave's recipe, because again, I'm a huge fan of his work. I more wanted to highlight why I chose to specialize in gelato as a home cook and as somebody designing recipes for home cooks, as well as specific choices I make for my personal style of gelato, such as making sure it's serviceable to no tempering, and always building a flavor around the ingredients and never just blending them into existing bases. So hopefully this experiment and video was interesting. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments. Otherwise, thank you for watching.